Picking up stitches in rows is quite simple, but takes a bit of thought in the way that it's worked. When you're hanging stitch to stitch, it's one stitch per needle hung onto the machine. However, because stitches aren't square, when you're hanging row to stitch, you need to take every 3 of 4 or every 2 of 3 groups of stitches. You'll see how this is worked when I hang it back on the machine in a second. In this example, I'm going to pick up 3 stitches, skip 1, pick up another 3 stitches, skip 1, and so on. I'm still going to hang them next to each other, but I'm spacing them out so I don't distort this edge. Because I want the knit side of this new hung edge to match, I need to hang from the purl side facing me. I also want to make sure that when I pick up these stitches, I'm picking up the whole last column of stitches. I should have a small V or 2 loops of yarn on the needle when I rehang. So here's 3 on the edge. I'm going to skip this row and pick up the next 3. Skip a row again. Pick up another 3. And continue on until the entire edge is hung. After the edge is hung, I'm going to go and make sure that I've only picked up 1 needle in 1 opening of the work. 2 needles cannot share the same opening, or the next pass of the carriage won't knit 2 separate stitches. It'll try to make 1 large stitch. It's almost as if you didn't cast on that 1 stitch. It's good to take your time here and make sure that you've caught everything appropriately so you don't run into any holes or runs as you move up. From the knit side, you can see how these 2 joined edges are interacting with one another. You could use this as a band if it were to be folded over with or without a turning row. You could make buttonholes in this, whatever you like. If you look closely, you can see that I was successful in picking up those last, between the last 2 columns of stitches. This gives a nice join between the 2. All right, in this next bit, which is far more straightforward, I'm gonna pick up stitch per stitch. So I don't need to skip any stitches in between. I'll simply hang 1 stitch per needle, the same number of needles I knit across to make this swatch. Again, make sure that you're picking up both legs of the V. In this instance, I did the latch tool around the gate peg bind off. So your edge, depending on the bind off method you choose, may look a little bit different, but make sure you're picking up the whole edge. Again, you'll see here in a second how I've split that last edge and I've only got 1 loop over the top. Pick up both. It'll make for a cleaner join. In a sense, this is very similar to picking up from waste yarn, only we're working over a closed edge instead of one that's held open by the waste yarn. Because there's quite a bit of bulk, and this is true for the other method as well, it's best that these needles are brought all the way to hold with some weight added before you knit across, just to make sure that everything knits off cleanly. So I bound off this top edge, and now you can see a little bit more closely from the knit side the join, and from the purl side as well, just a bit of extra bulk back there. You will notice on the knit side though that I failed to pick up both legs of the stitch here on the right hand side, and this leaves a less than desirable edge, though I suppose if you were meticulous about it and repeated this everywhere, it could lead to a decorative piped effect, but I wouldn't recommend it. All right, in this next bit, we're going to have to contend with hanging both stitch to stitch and row to stitch. So here in this, if you imagine kind of flat extended edge of a cardigan neckline, I can pick up those stitches just as I normally would, but then I'll have to use that 3/4 kind of rule of thumb to pick up the neckline since it transitions from bound off stitches at the neck edge, center front, to rows along that kind of slanted, sloped, curved edge of the front neck. So I picked up that extended center front edge. I know there are five columns of stitches, so I will pick them up across 5 needles. And then I'll begin picking up that sloped, rounded neckline shape, beginning with skipping one, hanging three, skipping one, hanging three. Again, in order for you to achieve a clean edge, you need to make sure that you're always picking up in the right spot. So when you're hanging row to stitch, make sure you've got that most end column of stitches above the transfer tool before you put it onto the machine. Skip one, pick up three. You can figure this out mathematically, however. For me, it seems to work out 9 times out of 10, sometimes more. Um, Hanging in this method by taking 3/4 of every group. So this is kind of my default or preferred method of hanging rows to stitches. So once I've got everything hung on here, I'm gonna hang some weight and then knit a little mini single neck edge. This isn't meant to look amazing. This is just to provide some frame of reference for method. After I knit several rows, in real life, of course, you would calculate the height of your desired band and knit to spec. I'm going to bind off. I'm just using the around the gate peg method with the latch tool. This doesn't produce a very elastic edge, but for this sample, and again for a cardigan that's going to have a center front opening that doesn't require it be pulled over the top of the head, this edge finish is just fine. I'm not a huge fan of single bands or neck edges anyway, but still a valid technique. After a quick steam, you can see that this has produced a pretty nice edge. I've managed to pick up in all the right places along the row to stitch and the stitch to stitch areas, and it's formed this decent band.